The wind across the high desert carries secrets that most people will never hear. It sweeps across vast stretches of sand and stone, through valleys where nothing grows, and over ridges that cut the horizon like jagged teeth. Out here, in the empty places where civilization has planted its flags but never truly taken root, there are stories that don't make it into official reports. Stories that get buried under classification stamps and non-disclosure agreements. Stories that soldiers whisper to each other in the dark, when the night watch stretches long and the silence becomes too heavy to bear alone. This is one of those stories. It begins in the winter of 1987 at a remote military installation that we'll call Forward Operating Base Carthage. The name isn't real, of course. None of the names in this story are. The Department of Defense has made certain of that. But the place was real enough. Carthage sat in the high desert of the American Southwest, about 200 miles from anything that could be called a town. It was one of dozens of facilities scattered across the vast military testing ranges that cover millions of acres of federal land, places where the government conducts experiments and training exercises away from civilian eyes. Carthage wasn't a large base. At its peak operational capacity, it housed maybe 60 personnel, a rotating crew of guards, maintenance workers, a handful of officers, and the occasional visiting scientist or engineer. The facility itself consisted of a small cluster of prefabricated buildings painted in desert camouflage, a motor pool with a half-dozen vehicles, a communications tower, and a perimeter fence topped with razor wire. Beyond the fence, there was nothing but desert in every direction. Miles and miles of scrubland and dried creek beds, punctuated by the occasional rock formation that rose from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature. The base had been built in the 1960s as an auxiliary research station, part of the infrastructure supporting weapons testing and other classified projects conducted in the region. By the 1980s, its primary purpose had shifted. Carthage had become what the military called a monitoring station, a listening post equipped with sensitive detection equipment designed to track seismic activity, radiation signatures, and other phenomena associated with underground nuclear tests. The Cold War was still very much alive in 1987. And facilities like Carthage played a quiet but crucial role in maintaining America's nuclear deterrent. The men and women stationed at Carthage knew their work was important, but that didn't make it any less monotonous. Days blended together in a haze of routine maintenance checks, equipment calibrations, and the endless waiting that defines so much of military life. The isolation wore on people. Some handled it better than others. The base commander, a career officer named Colonel Marcus Henley, ran a tight ship and made sure his people stayed busy, stayed sharp. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam and understood that idle minds in isolated places could become dangerous things.
It was Henley who first noticed that something was wrong, though he wouldn't have described it that way at the time. It started small, the way these things always do. Little anomalies that could be explained away, dismissed as equipment malfunctions or human error. In early December, the seismic monitors began registering unusual readings. Nothing dramatic, just low-frequency vibrations that appeared sporadically, usually in the pre-dawn hours. The patterns didn't match any known geological activity, and they didn't correspond to any scheduled testing in the region. The duty officers logged the readings and sent them up the chain of command, but no one seemed particularly concerned. Probably just the machines acting up, they said. Equipment gets temperamental in the cold desert nights. But then other things started happening. Small things. Strange things. The perimeter motion sensors would trigger in the middle of the night, sending guards scrambling to investigate, only to find nothing there. No animals, no tracks, no signs of intrusion. Just empty desert, stretching away into darkness. The base dogs, 2 German shepherds that lived in kennels near the motor pool and were used for security patrols, began acting oddly. They would bark at nothing, staring out into the desert with their hackles raised, refusing to move forward during evening patrols. Their handler, a young specialist named Torres, reported that both dogs had become increasingly agitated and difficult to control. Then there were the sounds. It started with the night watch guards reporting distant noises carried on the wind. Mechanical sounds, some said, like heavy machinery moving underground. Others described it differently, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Some guards swore they could hear voices in those sounds, though they could never quite make out words, just the suggestion of human speech, twisted and distorted beyond recognition. Sergeant First Class David Reeves was the first person to see something he couldn't explain. Reeves was a lifer, a career non-commissioned officer with 18 years of service and a reputation for being unflappable. He'd served in Korea, in Germany, and half a dozen other postings around the world. He wasn't the kind of man given to flights of fancy or nervous reactions to shadows in the dark. But on the night of December 18, 1987, something shook him badly enough that he filed an official incident report, a document that would later disappear from the base's records, but which several people remember reading. Reeves was conducting a routine perimeter inspection at approximately 0230 hours. It was a cold night, temperature hovering just above freezing, with a half moon providing enough light to see by. He was walking the eastern fence line, about a quarter mile from the main cluster of buildings, when he noticed something moving in the desert beyond the wire. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a coyote or maybe a deer, though deer were rare in that part of the desert. He stopped and raised his flashlight, playing the beam across the scrubland. What he saw made him freeze. There was something out there, maybe 50 yards beyond the fence, something large. It stood upright, roughly man-shaped, but wrong in ways that Reeves struggled to articulate later. Too tall, he said, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and the proportions were off, the limbs too long, the torso too narrow. It wasn't moving, just standing there in the darkness, and Reeves had the unmistakable impression that it was watching him. He could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against him across the empty space. For a long moment, neither the sergeant nor the thing in the desert moved. Reeves later said that he felt paralyzed, caught between the urge to raise his weapon and a deeper, more primal instinct that told him any aggressive action would be a terrible mistake. His hand had moved to his sidearm, a standard-issue Beretta M9, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he just stood there, pinned by that invisible gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, as suddenly as he'd noticed it, the thing was gone. Not running away, not moving off into the darkness, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. One moment, Reeves was staring at this impossible figure silhouetted against the moonlit desert, and the next, he was looking at empty space. He swept his flashlight back and forth, searching, but there was nothing. No tracks, no disturbance in the sand, no sign that anything had been there. Reeves completed his patrol at double time, returning to the guard post faster than regulations strictly required. He filed his report immediately, describing what he'd seen in careful, measured language. When Colonel Henley read the report the next morning, he called Reeves into his office for a private conversation. What exactly was said between them remains unclear,
but Reeves never spoke publicly about the incident again. Those who knew him said he seemed different after that night. Quieter, more withdrawn. He started requesting assignment to the day shifts, avoiding night duty whenever possible.